A single ember drifts through the dark, glowing like a tiny star as it floats above an ancient landscape. In the distance, shadows of mountains rise like sleeping giants, and the wind carries the soft echo of footsteps, the footsteps of the first people who dared to carve their future from untouched earth. A warm light blooms across the horizon, revealing a world on the edge of transformation. Families bound by love and survival, communities rising from nothing but stone, fire, and faith. The quiet pride of those who shape tools with their bare hands. The pulse of discovery beating beneath every sunrise. This is the dawn of humanity. A time when each choice, each breath, carried the weight of everything yet to come. As you listen, imagine standing there. What would you notice first? The warmth of the fire, the heartbeat of the earth beneath your feet, or the quiet certainty that history is about to begin? Before we step into this world, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time of day is it for you right now? If this journey already stirs something in you, gently tap like and subscribe. It helps the story reach more dreamers like you. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and walk with me into the beginning. Somewhere along a gentle hillside, the earliest farmers stepped into the fields, their shadows stretching long in the dawn. The air was cool enough to sting the skin, yet soft in a way that promised warmth later in the day. Mist curled low around their ankles, clinging to the grasses, drifting slowly as though reluctant to leave the earth. Beyond the quiet slope, the world opened into a patchwork of plains, riverbanks and distant ridges, all bathed in the faint glow of early morning. It was a landscape in transition, touched by the last whispers of the Ice Age, yet already holding the calm breath of a new era. But this peaceful moment, this simple act of stepping into a field, was the result of countless generations who had lived before these early farmers. For tens of thousands of years, humanity had followed the slow, steady rhythm of the land. They were wanderers who moved with the seasons, who listened to the migrations of herds, who knew the stars as familiar companions and the changing winds as old guides. They lived lightly upon the earth, never staying long enough in one place to leave more than a faint trace of their presence. Their fires burned briefly, their camps vanished, and only the stories carried in memory marked their passage. As the world warmed, something subtle began to shift. Snowfields retreated up distant mountains, revealing rocky slopes beneath. Forests crept slowly across plains, where there had once been only cold winds and brittle grasses. Rivers swelled with new life, fed by melting ice far to the north. Animals changed their movements, following fresh paths through the rejuvenated land. And humans, ever perceptive, felt the change not only in the air, but in their way of living. They sensed new opportunities, new uncertainties, and a kind of quiet invitation from the world around them. Imagine walking through such a place at dawn. The ground beneath your feet still holds the chill of the night, firm yet forgiving. The sky above is pale and vast, the colour of soft smoke. You might hear nothing but your own breath, the quiet thud of your footsteps, and the distant trill of waking birds. Here and there, clusters of wild barley or einkorn shimmer with dew, their delicate heads swaying gently. Even without knowing their future importance, people notice these plants. how they returned year after year, how they ripened in the warmth of summer, how they fed animals, and how they themselves felt stronger after eating their seeds. The earliest humans were observers long before they were cultivators. They watched the way a plant grew, the way an animal behaved, the way seasons unfolded. Over generations, these observations were shared as stories, sometimes whispered beside fires, sometimes told to children as they gathered berries or watched the horizon. And with every story, knowledge deepened. They began to understand which plants thrived in sunlight, which survived drought, which drew animals near. Their bond with the land was not sudden or dramatic. It was a quiet familiarity built across thousands of years. On this hillside, as those first early farmers moved slowly across the dew-laden landscape, their actions carried echoes of those older times. In their hands, they held simple stone tools shaped with care and skill, passed down through uncounted generations. These tools were the descendants of pieces once used by their wandering ancestors. Tools for cutting, scraping, digging, prying. In the earliest days of humanity, these objects had been lifelines, forged from necessity. By the Neolithic dawn, they had become instruments of intention, crafted with patience and purpose for a new kind of life. The land around them changed not only in temperature, but in meaning. Where once a site was only a temporary camp, used briefly before the next journey, it now became a place to return to, a site of memory. Families began to stay in one area longer than before. They observed the cycles of plants not just for a single season, but over years. They learned when certain grasses dropped seeds, how long those seeds took to sprout, and what conditions encouraged growth. The world was slowly becoming a teacher, its lessons patient and gentle. You might imagine small groups of people gathering at the edge of a clearing, looking out over the horizon as the first warmth of sunlight touched the grasses. There was a quiet sense of hope in the air. Not a dramatic hope, but a subtle one. The kind that grows slowly, like roots beneath the soil. They noticed how some plants flourished where their fires had burned the previous year. They saw how grains clustered more densely in places where seeds had fallen near their old hearths. These observations were the beginnings of something profound, though they could not yet see the future unfolding beneath their feet. At night, the sky would stretch above them in a sweep of stars, clearer and darker than anything we see today. The Milky Way would arc like a luminous river, a silent companion to their thoughts. Around their fires, families huddled close, sharing warmth as they listened to elders speak of times before the Great Warming. Stories of long winters, of vast herds, of icy winds that shaped the face of the world. And between those tales, new ones emerged. Stories of changing seasons, of plants growing in familiar places, of the possibility that life might become more predictable than it had ever been. In these early gatherings, you can almost feel the shift of thought, the first quiet spark of understanding that humanity's relationship with the land was changing. No longer was the world a place to wander endlessly, a vast expanse of uncertainty. It was becoming something else, a partner, a presence that offered renewal if treated with care. Perhaps the earliest farmers didn't think of it in such words, yet the feeling was there in their actions, in the way they lingered near water sources, in the way they chose sheltered valleys, in the way they began to return to the same places year after year. As the morning continued on that hillside, the farmers' steps became more deliberate. They bent to check the soil, to study the tender shoots emerging from the ground. Their touch was gentle, testing the moisture, the firmness, the scent of the earth. They had learned over generations that the soil could tell them more than words ever could, whether it was too dry, too cold, too washed by rain. They were not yet the farmers of later centuries, not yet masters of irrigation or architecture, but they were the first to see the land with a new kind of attention. You can imagine the expressions on their faces: thoughtful, unhurried, peaceful. Farming, in its earliest form, was not the labour of vast fields or heavy tools. It was quiet observation. It was patience. It was a willingness to listen to the world rather than bend it. And in this gentle beginning, humanity started to place its first roots into the earth. The children, still too young to understand the significance of these new behaviours, played near the edges of the settlement. They poked sticks into the soil, tossed pebbles into shallow streams, collected feathers, leaves, and curious stones. Their laughter drifted lightly across the air, mingling with birdsong and the faint flutter of insects. Even in their play, they absorbed the rhythms of life around them. They watched their parents tend to the land, and though they did not yet grasp the meaning, they would inherit the knowledge effortlessly, as naturally as breathing. Around midday, the warmth deepened, drawing scents from the soil, earthy, sweet, full of promise. Long before written language, long before rituals or monuments or sacred symbols carved in stone, this scent alone might have been enough to tell early people that the world was ready to nourish them. The land was no longer merely a space to travel through. It was becoming a home. In the afternoon quiet, when the sun cast soft gold across the plains, you might see small groups walking slowly along the edges of wild grain patches. Their movements were unhurried, shaped by countless generations of knowing the land intimately. They would test the ripeness of seeds, gather handfuls gently, and place them into woven baskets made with long, pliable grasses. These baskets, though simple, represented another subtle shift. The beginning of tools made not just for survival, but for gathering, storing, and planning for the future. As the day softened toward evening, the farmers returned to their settlement. Smoke rose from small fires, curling upward in thin, graceful lines. Within their shelters, made from reeds, branches, and animal skins, the warmth of shared meals and familiar voices created a sense of belonging that older generations may never have known. There was comfort here, stability, the beginnings of community rooted in place rather than movement, and all of it, every seed gathered, every fire kindled, every step into a field, marked the earliest heartbeat of the Neolithic Age. An age born not from sudden change, but from slow, quiet unfolding, from listening to the earth, from adapting with gentleness, from recognizing the potential hidden in the simple act of returning to the same place again and again. The world had warmed, the land had awakened, and humanity stood on the threshold of a transformation that would shape every future generation. And as night settles once more over the hillside, the earliest farmers rest beside their small fires, unaware that their quiet choices will one day become the foundation of all settled life. Yet tomorrow, as dawn breaks again, they will rise with the same calm purpose, stepping gently into fields that carry the promise of a new world. The night faded slowly, as though reluctant to release its cool embrace, and the first soft hints of dawn stretched across the land. Within the small settlement, families stirred quietly, rising not because of urgency, but because the rhythm of the season guided them. The air carried a faint scent of damp earth, touched by the memory of last night's dew. Somewhere nearby, a single bird called out, its notes light and wavering, as if testing whether the world was ready to wake. As the earliest rays of sunlight brushed the horizon, a few figures stepped out from their simple shelters. They moved calmly, unhurried, wrapped in the warmth of animal skins or woven fibers softened by many seasons of use. These were the first caretakers of the land, the ones who had begun to understand that soil could be more than a surface to walk upon. It could be shaped, encouraged, and invited to bring forth life. One of the adults knelt by a patch of disturbed ground, where the previous afternoon they had scattered seeds saved from earlier harvests of wild grain. The seeds were small enough to be carried by the wind, but the hands that placed them were patient and careful, pressing them gently beneath the surface. Not deeply, just enough to keep them safe from hungry birds and the chill of night. The individual brushed fingertips lightly over the soil, as though offering reassurance, and rose with a quiet breath. There was nothing dramatic in these gestures, no ceremony, no grand announcement of change. But within such small acts, the future was quietly being shaped. Farming did not begin with wide fields and abundant crops. It began with a simple curiosity. What if the seeds we gather could grow near where we sleep? What if we did not always have to follow herds and ripening plants across vast distances? What if the land itself could be encouraged to remain generous? The earliest humans did not farm in the way later civilizations would. They were not yet ploughing deep furrows or clearing vast tracts of land. Instead, their approach was gentle, shaped by long familiarity with the rhythms of nature. They scattered seeds among wild grasses, tended patches near streams, and learned from the small signs the earth offered. A change in colour, a new softness in the soil, a certain fragrance that drifted upward when the ground was turned. Not far from the hillside, a narrow stream wound its way through tall reeds. Here, the soil was loose and moist, a natural cradle for early crops. People gathered along its banks, dipping woven baskets into the cool water to carry back to their homes. The sound of the stream was calming, a soft murmur that blended with the rustle of leaves overhead. As the water flowed, it shaped the land gently, creating pockets where silt gathered. These pockets became rich with nutrients, perfect places for seeds to root. One woman paused at the edge of the water, noticing how the morning sunlight sparkled across tiny grains that had settled in the mud. She dipped her hand slowly, letting the water flow over her fingers, and watched how the grains shifted. Even such simple movements taught her something. The understanding of farming grew from watching how seeds behaved in water, how they fell from plants, how they sprouted where the soil held just the right balance of warmth and moisture. In the early days of farming, people continued to gather food from the wild, berries, nuts, edible roots, and the meat of small animals. But farming offered something new: reliability. For the first time, humans began to sense that the world could provide for them, even when the wild harvests were sparse. They could plan. They could hope for a future that did not depend entirely on chance or migration. The shift was subtle, but profound. Instead of waking each morning wondering where food might be found, families began to wake with a sense of purpose, to check the soil, to observe the sprouting shoots, to protect them from animals or harsh weather. The land became a partner in survival, a quiet presence woven into daily life. As the sun climbed higher, a group of children wandered beyond the settlement, their small footsteps leaving faint impressions in the soft earth. They followed a trail of wild barley that grew in a golden cluster at the base of a ridge. While playing, they noticed that the grains fell easily when the stalks were shaken. Laughing softly, they collected handfuls and carried them back to their families. Such simple experiences taught them instinctively what older generations had begun to understand. Seeds were treasures not only for eating, but for planting. The adults took the grains from the children with gentle smiles, spreading them out to dry on a flat stone warmed by the sun. The stone held a pleasant heat, soft and steady, drawing moisture from the seeds. These stones became a familiar sight around the settlement, places where seeds were dried, sorted, and prepared. Over time, the act of drying and tending to seeds became a comforting ritual, one that brought families together in shared purpose. In the afternoon, the land shimmered beneath the sunlight. The hillside, once just a resting place along a journey, had become a space of intention. People moved slowly through the tall grasses, listening to the rustle beneath their feet. They marked the places where the soil was fertile, where the sunlight was gentle, where the water lingered longest after the rains. These simple observations shaped the first maps humanity ever knew, not drawn on parchment or clay, but remembered in the mind and passed on through quiet teaching. At the edge of the settlement, an older man sat on a smooth rock, sharpening a stone blade with deliberate strokes. Each movement produced a faint whispering sound as stone met stone, a calming, steady rhythm. The tool would be used for cutting grasses or shaping small trenches in the soil. Though simple in form, such tools changed everything. They were no longer meant solely for hunting or preparing hides. They were becoming instruments of cultivation, of shaping the land gently instead of merely using what it offered. As evening approached, the light softened, turning the sky into a wash of pale gold and muted rose. Families gathered near their hearths, where the smell of roasting seeds and wild herbs drifted upward. The fires cast warm circles of light, illuminating faces relaxed by the day's peaceful work. Someone recounted a memory from a past season, a time when seeds scattered accidentally had sprouted in abundance. Others listened, nodding slowly, recognizing the significance of such chance events. In these moments, knowledge was not taught through commands or strict lessons. It flowed like the stream nearby, naturally gently, from one generation to the next. Children dozed beside their parents, lulled by the murmuring voices and the soft crackle of fire. Elders spoke quietly, recalling how the land had looked before the warming, how ice had once clung stubbornly to the mountains. Their stories held both the memory of hardship and the hope of renewal. Somewhere in the quiet of night, a breeze moved across the hillside, carrying with it the faint scent of new growth. Tiny shoots rested beneath the soil, sheltered in darkness, holding the promise of transformation. They did not know they were shaping history. They simply followed the silent instructions written into the earth, to grow when the time was right, to reach toward the sun, to offer their grains generously. And in the same way, humanity followed a quiet instinct, to watch, to learn, to nurture. The first seeds of farming were not just placed into soil, They were placed into the human way of life, into memory, into tradition, into a future where the bond between people and land would become unbreakably strong. Tomorrow, the earliest farmers would rise again, stepping softly over the hillside to check the tender shoots. And each day, without realizing it, they would take one more step into the Neolithic world. The morning began with a soft haze that wrapped itself around the settlement like a gentle cloak. Thin strands of mist drifted across the ground, curling around woven baskets, sleeping mats, and the quiet forms of those who had risen early to tend to the fields. The air carried a cool sweetness, touched by the scents of damp grass and distant wildflowers. It was the kind of morning that invited reflection, still, unhurried, holding the promise of a quiet transformation. For countless generations before this moment, people had lived by following the land rather than settling upon it. The idea of a permanent home was unfamiliar. Shelter had always been something temporary, crafted quickly from branches, grasses, or skin, used for a few days or weeks before being left behind as the group moved onward. Movement itself had been the rhythm of life, following herds, tracing rivers, navigating forests and plains in an endless cycle guided by the seasons. But now, something subtle was changing. Humanity was beginning to feel the pull of certain places. Locations where the soil was rich, the water nearby, the climate gentle, and the harvest reliable enough to keep families nourished. These places were no longer mere stops along a journey. They were beginning to feel like home. At the center of the settlement, a group of early dwellings formed a loose circle. They were simple but sturdy, built with a new sense of intention. Some were supported by wooden frames covered with woven mats. Others used reeds and branches layered carefully for strength. A few of the more established families had begun experimenting with mixtures of mud and straw, pressing them into shapes that hardened under the sun, creating walls that felt more permanent than anything their ancestors had known. Inside these shelters, warmth lingered long after the fires had dimmed. Ashes glowed softly in clay-lined pits, casting faint amber light across the floors. The smell of last night's grains and herbs still hung in the air. A comforting reminder that food now came from familiar hands and familiar soil, not from uncertain journeys into the unknown. Quiet footsteps approached the edge of the settlement, where elders often gathered at dawn. They sat upon smooth stones or weathered logs, warmed by the first rays of sunlight. Their faces were lined with years of movement. Long trails walked, storms endured, starlit nights remembered. Yet now, even they seemed to rest more deeply, their bodies relaxing into the sense that this place might hold them for many seasons to come. One of the elders, a woman known for her keen understanding of the land, lifted her gaze toward the horizon. From her seat, she could see the fields where the first shoots of grain had begun to rise in delicate green arcs. She remembered a time when such growth would have been gathered quickly, consumed, and left behind as the group continued onward. But now the plants were no longer just food. They were indicators, messengers of a changing world. Their very presence tied the people to this land. A soft breeze stirred the grasses, carrying with it the faint sounds of laughter. Children were already awake, their playful voices rising and falling like the call of small birds. They ran between the shelters, weaving around baskets and hearths, stopping now and then to examine beetles, feathers, or interesting stones. Their games traced paths through the settlement, paths that grew more familiar each day. And in their play, they were making something remarkable, memory connected to place. Far beyond the settlement's outer edge, faint traces of the old life still remained, paths worn into the ground by generations who had walked them. These paths stretched toward distant forests and river valleys, reminders of a world where movement meant survival. Hunters still traveled along these routes, sometimes venturing far for the fresh meat that supplemented the growing reliance on plants. The skills of tracking, listening, and reading the land had not vanished. They remained essential, woven into the identity of the people. But now, when the hunters returned, they returned to the same hearths, the same familiar faces, the same steady ground. The transition between wandering and settling was not sudden or absolute. There were still seasons when some families left for a time, following old instincts or seeking resources not found nearby. But each year, fewer wandered far. The land held them gently, its offerings too valuable to leave behind for long. Near the stream, a pair of women bent over freshly gathered reeds, weaving them into mats that would line the floors of new shelters. The reeds were pliable, fragrant, and strong. Their fingers moved expertly, guiding each strand into place with a practiced rhythm. As they worked, they spoke quietly about the seasons, about the new shoots appearing across the hillside, about how different life felt now that the settlement had begun to grow. One of them paused to look toward the fields. "The earth remembers us," she murmured. "It welcomes us back." The other nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Their ancestors had left only fleeting marks upon the land. Now, the land was beginning to hold their presence in a deeper way. A short distance away, a young man knelt beside an unfinished shelter. He pressed handfuls of mud and straw onto the frame, smoothing each layer with gentle, patient motions. The mixture clung to his hands, cool and sticky, leaving earthy streaks along his arms. As he worked, he hummed softly, a tune passed down from older generations, though the words, if there had ever been any, had long since been forgotten. The song was simple, a quiet repetition that matched the steady rhythm of shaping the walls. Inside the settlement, fires crackled softly as families prepared morning meals. Grains roasted in shallow bowls, their warm, nutty aroma drifting upward. A pot of water simmered nearby, filled with roots and wild herbs that produced a fragrant steam. The smell of food was no longer tied to the unpredictability of the hunt. It was tied to daily life, to tasks performed with care, to a place that sustained them. As the morning deepened, more people emerged from their shelters, moving with a sense of purpose. Some headed toward the fields to observe the young plants. Others tended fires, shaped tools, gathered water, or checked the stores of seeds and dried herbs. Each task was simple, yet each carried meaning. These were not the hurried, necessary actions of travelers preparing to move on. They were the actions of people building a life, piece by gentle piece. There was no single moment when they decided to settle. No meeting around a fire where someone declared that their wandering days were over. Instead, settlement drifted into their lives the way dawn drifts across the sky. Gradually, softly, almost invisibly. One day they realized they had returned to the same place for a second season. Later, a third, then a fourth. They built shelters meant to last longer, stored more food than needed for a single journey, and created hearths that remained warm even when the night winds grew cold. And so the settlement grew, not from ambition, but from familiarity, from the comfort of knowing the soil beneath their feet, from the quiet reassurance of waking each day surrounded by the same trees, the same river, the same sheltering hills. In the stillness of the afternoon, when the sun reached its highest point and shadows softened beneath the shelters, the land felt peaceful. Birds glided overhead, dipping low through the warm air. Insects buzzed lazily. The fields shimmered. And the people, once wanderers, rested in the knowledge that they no longer had to chase the world. The world had come to meet them. As evening approached, gentle hands rekindled fires, drawing sparks that danced upward like small stars. The settlement glowed with circles of light and warmth. Families gathered once more, telling stories of the old paths and the new life they were shaping. Some still felt the pull of distant places, the echoes of a time when the horizon itself was their home. But even they could feel the quiet truth settling around them. Roots were growing, both in the soil and in the hearts of the people. And so, under the soft sweep of twilight, the settlement breathed as one, steady, warm, and filled with the promise of a life no longer defined by endless wandering. The morning settled gently over the small settlement, its first light filtering through reeds and the soft lattice of woven branches that formed the walls of early homes. Shadows stretched long and delicate, tracing the shapes of baskets, tools, and sleeping mats, with a kind of quiet tenderness. The air was cool, but not cold, a comfortable stillness that carried the promise of another slow, steady day. You could feel the presence of life in the faint rustle of grasses, the distant trill of awakening birds, and the soft hum of insects stirring beneath the warming soil. In these gentle hours, the heart of the community revealed itself. Movement began not with urgency, but with familiarity. A woman emerged from her shelter and knelt near a small clay-lined hearth, coaxing last night's embers with careful breaths. Thin tendrils of smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of charred wood and cooked grains. A few steps away, an older man stretched his legs slowly, feeling the comfort of familiar ground beneath him. The ground he had walked for seasons upon seasons. The ground that now anchored his life in ways he might not have expected in his youth. The settlement no longer felt like a temporary resting place. It felt like a living organism, breathing, growing, learning. What had begun as a cluster of shelters had gradually expanded into something that resembled an early village. Not large, not intricate, but filled with the beginnings of social bonds and shared purpose. Paths had formed naturally between homes, worn into the soil by countless footsteps. They were not planned or marked, yet each one held meaning, connecting spaces where daily tasks unfolded. There was the path leading to the fields, where rows of early crops reached slowly toward the sun. Another wound its way toward the stream, where fresh water glimmered between reeds. A third path curved gently toward the small gathering area, where elders shared stories and families met to exchange food, tools, or quiet conversation. In the soft brightness of mid-morning, people moved along these paths with ease. Some carried woven baskets filled with seeds or herbs, their footsteps light and unhurried. Others paused to speak with neighbours, exchanging a few words accompanied by calm gestures. These exchanges, though simple, were the earliest signs of community life. No longer did families exist in isolation or rely solely on their own efforts. They began to share knowledge, help one another, and build a collective memory of how to live with the land. Near the centre of the settlement stood one of the earliest communal hearths. Its stones had been arranged by many hands over time, each one chosen for its shape, its position, its ability to hold heat. Around this hearth, people gathered not only to cook, but to talk, to teach, to rest. The hearth had become more than a source of warmth. It was a point of connection. Flames flickered softly during the evenings, casting a warm glow on faces lined with both age and youth. During the day, its ashes reminded everyone of shared meals, shared efforts, shared moments of quiet companionship. In the late morning sunlight, children played near the communal hearth, their laughter rising like birdsong into the open air. They chased each other between the huts, weaving through shadows and patches of sunlight. Their games were simple, rolling stones, imitating the motions of elders working in the fields, creating small structures of sticks and mud. Yet these moments were powerful. The children were growing up with a sense of belonging to a place, to a group, to a rhythm that extended beyond their own families. Their memories would not be shaped by endless travel, but by the comforting familiarity of shared paths, shared fires, and shared work. A short walk from the communal hearth, the fields stretched in gentle curves along the hillside. Here, the earliest grains grew in small clusters, their young stalks swaying in the breeze. A few people bent over the plants, examining their progress. They touched the soil, felt its moisture, brushed away insects gently, and whispered quiet observations to one another. Farming was still in its earliest stages, more a collaboration with the land than a command over it. These farmers did not think of themselves as cultivating fields. They thought of themselves as caring for the places that had begun to care for them. A woman crouched to observe a patch of particularly vibrant green shoots. She pressed her hand into the soil beside them, feeling the warmth that had collected through the morning. "This place remembers," she said softly, speaking to no one in particular. Her companion, a younger man, nodded thoughtfully. They both understood that seeds planted here grew better than elsewhere. The land had begun teaching them, guiding them toward understanding which pockets of earth were most fertile, which slopes held the right balance of sun and shade, which places welcomed the tender beginnings of life. Back within the village, another important transformation was unfolding: the development of shared tasks. No longer did each family perform every task alone. Some people excelled in crafting stone tools with remarkable precision. Others were skilled at weaving reeds into strong mats or baskets. A few had a keen eye for tracking animals or identifying edible plants. Over time, these individual strengths began to shape subtle roles within the village. There was no hierarchy, no titles, but there was recognition. A quiet, mutual understanding of who did what best. Near a large flat stone, warmed by the sun, a skilled toolmaker shaped a new blade from a piece of flint. Each strike of the hammerstone produced a soft, rhythmic click, sending small flakes of stone scattering. The toolmaker's hands were steady, practiced. Those who passed nearby occasionally paused to watch, not out of curiosity alone, but out of admiration. These tools were essential for gathering, for cutting, for shaping shelters. And though each piece was simple, its creation held a beauty that spoke of patience and dedication. The presence of shared work deepened the sense of community. Tasks were no longer isolated efforts. They were part of a larger rhythm that defined daily life. When one family harvested wild plants, they often shared with their neighbors. When another family built a new shelter, others came to help. These exchanges were not based on obligation. They grew naturally from a shared understanding that life was easier, richer, and more secure when experienced together. As the sun reached its highest point, a peaceful stillness settled over the village. People rested in the shade of their shelters, sipping water from carved wooden bowls or eating meals made from roasted grains and fresh herbs. In these quiet moments, the village felt like a single breath, slow, steady, harmonious. Yet even in rest, there was an awareness of what they were creating. A place where children could grow up remembering the same paths, the same hearths, the same fields. A place where knowledge could accumulate, where the lessons of one season could be applied to the next. A place where each shelter added strength to the others, simply by being part of a shared whole. In the late afternoon, when the heat began to soften, the village hummed gently with renewed activity. A group of women gathered reeds from the stream's edge. Men carried newly crafted tools back to the central hearth. Elders taught younger members how to recognize subtle changes in the soil, the plants, the sky, and all around them, the land responded, whispering through the grasses, shimmering under the golden light, offering both its bounty and its quiet wisdom. By the time the evening arrived, the village glowed once more with circles of firelight. Families gathered close, sharing food, stories, and the comfort of companionship. The sky above darkened slowly, revealing the first shy stars. The air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and smoke and growing plants. In these moments, under the soft shimmer of twilight, the early village felt timeless. A place where the ancient rhythm of wandering had softened into the gentle cadence of belonging. What began as a simple settlement had become a community, bound not by walls or rules, but by shared purpose, shared memory, and shared hope. And as night wrapped the village in its quiet embrace, the people rested with a new sense of certainty. The land beneath them was no longer a waypoint on a journey. It was home. Morning arrived with a slow, golden hush, spreading warmth across the village as though the sun itself had placed a gentle hand upon the land. The first glimmers of light touched the stone tools arranged neatly beside one of the shelters, illuminating the smooth edges and sharp contours that told stories of patience, skill, and countless careful hours of shaping. These tools, simple, silent, yet profoundly important, were becoming the backbone of early village life. In the earliest days of humanity, stone tools had been carved quickly, roughly, focused only on immediate needs. But now, as people settled into familiar rhythms, the act of shaping stone became an art. There was time to refine, to experiment, to learn what each stone could become. Time itself felt different in a settled world, less urgent, more expansive, allowing hands and minds to explore possibilities that wandering lives rarely offered. A toolmaker sat cross-legged upon a flat rock near the centre of the village. The rock had been chosen deliberately, for its smooth surface allowed flakes of stone to fall freely without scattering. In his hand, he held a piece of flint, its pale surface glimmering faintly in the morning light. The toolmaker's fingers traced its edges with quiet familiarity. He had studied this piece for several days, observing its shape, imagining what lay hidden beneath its rough exterior. With a steady breath, he lifted the hammerstone and struck. The sound was soft, A crisp, delicate tap rather than a harsh blow. A thin flake slipped away from the flint, revealing a new surface beneath. He struck again and again, each movement precise and gentle. The flakes collected in a small pile beside him, tiny shards of the old world giving way to the new. Nearby, a young boy watched with wide eyes. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, fascinated by the transformation unfolding before him. To him, the toolmaker seemed like a sculptor who could coax purpose out of stone as easily as others coax warmth from fire. The boy had grown up in this village, surrounded by the sounds of crafting. The tapping of stone, the scraping of hides, the whisper of reeds woven into baskets. But the shaping of stone always captivated him most. The toolmaker glanced at the boy and smiled gently. "The stone tells you what it wants to become," he said in a quiet voice. "You only need to listen." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson. In a way, the toolmaker spoke not just of stone, but of the world itself. In this new era of settled life, people were learning to listen, to observe the land, the seasons, the movement of animals, the quiet shifts that guided their actions from day to day. Stone, fire, earth, and water were no longer just resources. They were companions, teachers, partners in a growing dialogue between humanity and its environment. Across the village, the smell of smouldering embers drifted through the air as families rekindled their hearths. Fire had always been essential, but now it played an even greater role. It cooked meals, warmed shelters, hardened clay vessels, and aided in crafting tools and pottery. The act of tending the fire became a daily ritual, often shared between generations. One elder sat beside her hearth, stirring the ashes with a stick until the glowing embers flickered back to life. As flames rose softly, she placed a small bundle of dried herbs onto the fire. The fragrant smoke curled upward, filling the air with a sweet, calming scent. Children wandered closer, comforted by the warmth and the smell they had known since infancy. Firelight danced across the clay walls of her shelter. These walls, built with hands both young and old, held the memory of many seasons, of storms endured, of harvests celebrated, of nights spent sharing stories. The elder brushed her hand across the surface, feeling its smoothness. Clay had become another transformative material in the village. At first, it was used simply to reinforce walls or line hearths, but gradually people realized it could be shaped, molded, fired into vessels that were both practical and beautiful. Near the stream, a group of women gathered fresh clay from the bank. Their fingers pressed into the soft earth, forming impressions that would be washed away by the next rain. They placed the clay into baskets, carrying it back to the village where it would be mixed with water, shaped into bowls, and left to dry in the sun. Each vessel reflected the hands that made it, some with smooth, even sides, others with the faint imprint of fingers that had pressed too hard or too softly. Imperfections did not matter. What mattered was the growing sense of mastery, the understanding that creation could take many forms. A young woman sat beneath the shade of a tree, rolling clay between her palms. She worked slowly, patiently, shaping a small cup meant for a child who had recently joined the village. Her movements were steady, her breathing calm. As she worked, she glanced toward the fields, where the green shoots of grain swayed rhythmically in the breeze. The connection between her work and the fields was clear. The vessels she shaped would one day hold the harvests they had only just begun to grow. The rhythm of the village deepened throughout the day. Stone tapping, clay moulding, fire crackling. All these sounds blended into a soothing chorus. Even the quiet scraping of hides being cleaned and softened added its gentle whisper to the atmosphere. These tasks had always existed, but now they carried a new purpose. They were not performed in haste before a journey. They were performed with intention, shaping the world the villagers were slowly building. As the sun climbed higher, the warmth grew stronger, wrapping the village in a gentle golden glow. The people paused their work to rest, gathering near the communal hearth or the shade of the tall trees. They shared water, food, and calm conversation. The toolmaker set aside his flint, satisfied with the progress he had made. The boy who had watched him now attempted to shape a small stone of his own, mimicking the toolmaker's movements with earnest concentration. Around midday, hunters returned from the distant ridges. Their steps were steady, their presence welcomed. Though farming had begun to transform life, hunting remained an important part of survival. The hunters carried bundles of dried meat, feathers, and bones, materials that would be used in countless ways throughout the village. The arrival of the hunters sparked quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the simple joy of reunion. In wandering days, such reunions might have been uncertain. Now, they were expected, woven into the rhythm of village life. As the afternoon softened into evening, long shadows stretched across the fields. The air cooled, carrying the scent of earth and ripening plants. Families finished their tasks and gathered once more near their hearths. The steep cliffs to the west glowed with warm light, then slowly faded into soft purples and blues. A peaceful stillness spread through the village as the first stars appeared overhead. The toolmaker examined the flint blade he had shaped earlier. It gleamed faintly in the fading light, its edges sharp and clean. He placed it carefully among other tools, each one representing not only its function but the patience and skill that had shaped it. Fire crackled softly nearby, casting a warm glow upon his hands. All around him, the village exhaled, a gentle, collective breath at the end of a purposeful day. Stone, fire, clay, and the steady beat of human hands had begun to transform this place. The old ways of wandering still lived in memory, but the new ways were taking root, quietly, steadily, like seeds beneath soft soil. A new world was being crafted, not through grand inventions or sudden change, but through countless small acts of patience and care. And as night settled fully over the village, with firelight flickering gently within each home, the people rested knowing they were shaping not just tools or shelters, but a future built with their own hands. The morning light crept gently over the fields, settling across the young grain in a soft wash of gold. The air was cool, touched by a faint breeze that rustled through the stalks like a whispered greeting. Dew clung to every blade of grass, sparkling as the sun rose higher, as though the earth itself had adorned the fields with tiny beads of light. In this quiet hour, the earliest farmers stepped softly onto the land, their movements slow and deliberate, guided less by urgency and more by the deepening understanding of the seasons. For generations, people had watched the natural world with the eyes of wanderers. They had known the migrations of animals, the patterns of stars, the scent of approaching storms, but the rhythm of planted fields, the cycle of seed, sprout, growth and harvest, was something new. It required a different kind of attention, a patience that unfolded in months rather than moments. The land no longer dictated where they should go. Instead, it began teaching them when to stay, when to work, when to wait, and when to hope. A woman knelt at the edge of the fields, her fingertips brushing lightly across the soil. She felt its warmth, its slight moisture, the softness that came from recent rains. These sensations guided her more than any measurement or tool could. She lifted her gaze toward the sky, noticing the thin clouds drifting lazily overhead. They carried no threat, just a gentle promise of mild weather. Today would be a good day for tending the fields. Other villagers joined her, forming a quiet line as they walked between the rows. Their eyes scanned the plants with care, noting which shoots were strong, which needed more space, which had been nibbled by animals during the night. They worked with simple tools, short digging sticks, stone blades, baskets woven from reeds. But their greatest tools were their observations, their memories of past seasons, and the knowledge shared among elders. Though the Neolithic Age had only just begun to unfold, these early farmers were already learning one of its most essential lessons. The earth offered its gifts slowly. Each day brought only small changes, a slight increase in height, a new leaf unfurling, a patch of soil growing darker after rain. To understand these changes required quiet attention, a kind of listening that involved all the senses. Near the center of the fields, a young girl crouched beside one of the taller shoots. She leaned in close, examining the delicate veins that traced through its leaves. Her hair fell forward as she studied the plant, and she brushed it back absently, her eyes full of wonder. She had grown up among these fields, and to her, the sight of new growth was as familiar as the rising sun. Yet she looked at each plant as though it were a small miracle. Her grandmother approached with slow, steady steps. She settled beside the girl and placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "Do you see how the leaves turn toward the sun?" the elder asked, her voice quiet and warm. "They are telling us the season is changing." The girl nodded, absorbing the insight. Every detail mattered. The angle of leaves, the color of stems, the feel of the soil beneath their hands. Over time, these details would become second nature, guiding the villagers through planting, tending, and harvesting with increasing confidence. As the morning progressed, the fields began to hum with quiet activity. Some villagers removed small weeds that threatened to choke the young plants. Others carried water from the nearby stream in clay vessels, sprinkling it carefully where the soil had grown too dry. A few checked the makeshift barriers they had built to keep grazing animals from wandering into the fields. These barriers were simple, woven branches, stones piled in loose rows. But they were gradually becoming more effective. While the adults worked, children played along the edges of the fields. Their laughter rose softly into the air, mingling with the rustle of grain and the distant call of birds. They chased each other between the rows, though always under the watchful eyes of their elders. When they tired, they sat in the shade and wove small garlands of wildflowers or inspected insects crawling across the soil. Even in play, they were learning the patterns of the land, where the earth was firm, where it was soft, where certain plants thrived. By midday, the sun rested high overhead, warming the world with a gentle insistence. The fields swayed in waves of soft movement, shimmering with life. The farmers retreated to the shade of a nearby tree, their baskets filled with weeds, herbs, and the occasional handful of edible greens found among the rows. They shared water and food, speaking quietly about the changing season. "The rains will come soon," one man murmured, wiping sweat from his brow. He had spent the morning clearing space between the rows so the young plants could breathe. "The clouds last night were low over the mountains." An elder nodded in agreement. "Yes, and the air carries that damp sweetness before the storms. We must prepare." To a wanderer, rain simply meant sheltering for a time and moving on afterward. But to settled people, rain was both a blessing and a responsibility. Too little meant dry soil and stunted growth. Too much meant washed out fields and ruined crops. Watching the skies became as important as tending the plants themselves. As the afternoon stretched on, the villagers returned to the fields for a final round of care. The sun had softened into a warm glow, angled just enough to cast long shadows. A few small birds hopped playfully among the plants, searching for insects. They flew away when people approached, returning moments later as if curious about the hum of activity. The farmers moved slowly, feeling the familiar rhythm of the land beneath their feet. They did not rush. Each task connected them more deeply to the earth, each observation feeding their growing understanding of the seasons. They knew now that a single day could change the future of a harvest. A sudden frost, an unexpected heat wave, a heavy rain, all could shape the months ahead. These uncertainties did not create fear, but rather a sense of humility. They had learned to accept the limits of their control. The land was generous, but it could not be forced. It responded to care, to patience, to attentiveness, and in return, it offered abundance, slowly, steadily, in its own time. As evening approached, the light softened into a warm, amber glow. The villagers gathered one last time at the edge of the fields, their faces relaxed by the long day's work. They exchanged nods of quiet satisfaction, taking in the sight of the gently rustling grain. Though the plants were still young, each one represented potential, not just for food, but for security, stability, and a new way of life. The young girl who had been studying leaves earlier placed her hand on her grandmother's arm. "Do the plants feel us watching them?" she asked softly. Her grandmother smiled, her expression gentle. "Perhaps they feel our care," she said, "and perhaps that is enough." As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the villagers turned back toward their homes. Smoke rose from hearths, glowing faintly as the first stars appeared in the sky. The village felt peaceful, held in the embrace of the land it tended so tenderly. The fields, now bathed in twilight, swayed softly as though breathing. The rhythm of the seasons had begun to weave itself into daily life, guiding hands, shaping choices, and carrying the village onward into a future shaped by patience, care, and quiet understanding. And beneath the cool surface of the soil, the roots deepened in silence, carrying the promise of another day. Morning unfolded slowly across the settlement, revealing the growing village with a soft golden clarity. The light caught the edges of mud brick walls and cast long shadows across the packed earth paths, softening every structure into warm, natural tones. Smoke rose in graceful lines from early hearths, drifting upward until it dissolved into the brightening sky. In these quiet moments, when the air still held the coolness of night, the village felt as though it were waking gently, stretching its limbs across the land it had begun to call home. The earliest shelters had been simple: branches bent into arcs, covered with animal skins or woven mats. But as seasons passed and families returned to the same familiar place again and again, the idea of building something more permanent began to take shape. People learned that the earth itself could provide not only food, but the materials to construct lasting homes. A young man knelt beside a shallow pit filled with clay-rich soil. He dug his fingers into the warm earth, feeling the malleability of it, the way it clung to his hands with a soft, welcoming texture. Beside him, an older woman mixed water into another pile of soil, her hands moving in slow, practiced circles. When the mixture reached the right consistency, firm enough to hold shape, soft enough to mold, they began forming bricks. Each handful was pressed into a wooden frame, smoothed carefully, then lifted out to dry in the sun. The bricks dried slowly, warmed by the steady heat of the day and cooled by the evening breeze. They hardened into shapes that felt both ancient and new, as though they carried within them the memory of centuries and the promise of seasons to come. Children helped in their own small ways, patting the sides of newly formed bricks with gentle palms or arranging them neatly in rows. Their laughter mixed with the soft thud of clay against wood, creating a rhythm that echoed across the growing village. In the center of the community, one of the older homes stood as a testament to the evolving craft. Its walls were built of mud brick and reinforced with bundles of reeds. The exterior bore faint impressions of fingertips and palm marks, the signatures of those who had shaped it. The roof, made from carefully layered branches and grasses, sloped gently to allow rain to run off. Inside, the floor had been smoothed with clay and lined in places with woven mats that added comfort and warmth. A woman stepped out from this home, stretching her arms as the soft light touched her face. Her fingertips brushed the walls as she passed, tracing the familiar texture. She remembered when the home had been built, how many hands had worked together, how many days they had spent shaping bricks, lifting them into place, sealing gaps with layers of clay. The memory filled her with a quiet pride. This was not merely a shelter from the elements. It was a testament to cooperation, to endurance, to the steady hands of the community. Nearby, a group of men gathered branches freshly cut from a grove of young trees. Though the grove had been carefully tended, only a few branches were taken, ensuring the trees would continue to grow strong. They carried the branches back to the village, where they stripped the bark, smoothed the wood, and prepared the pieces to reinforce a new home. Each movement was thoughtful, measured. These early builders understood how important it was to honor the land that supported them. At the same time, a group of women prepared the interior space of another dwelling. They packed the earthen floor with care, pressing the soil until it formed a firm, level surface. Over time, they added layers of ground chalk and clay, smoothing it until it gleamed softly in the light. Around the edges, woven mats were placed to create warm areas for resting or sleeping. Clay vessels, some plain, some decorated with simple incised patterns, lined the hearthside. Each vessel held something essential: dried grains, herbs, seeds for planting, water gathered from the stream. The hearth, always the heart of the home, was carefully shaped from clay and stone. It was positioned to warm the dwelling while allowing smoke to escape through small openings in the roof. Firelight cast warm patterns across the walls, making the interior feel alive, even in the quietest hours of night. As the day grew brighter, the village became a gentle flurry of activity. People moved in and out of homes, carrying materials, tools, or baskets filled with food. The sounds of crafting, the tapping of stone, the scooping of clay, the snapping of branches, blended into a soft, harmonious chorus. A pair of elders walked between the homes, observing the work with thoughtful expressions. They spoke quietly about how different the village looked now compared to the early days. "When we first built shelters here," one said, "we did not know if we would stay." The other nodded. "But the land welcomed us back each season, and now our homes grow stronger with every year." Their voices carried a kind of gentle awe, not the excitement of sudden change, but the deep appreciation of a life gradually shaped by many hands. Near the edge of the village, a family worked on expanding their home. The father pressed new bricks into place, while the mother smoothed the seams with wet clay. Their young daughter gathered reeds from a nearby patch, her small arms full of the long, pliant stalks. She placed them beside the wall, humming softly to herself. Her contributions were small, but they mattered. Every reed, every handful of clay, every moment spent tending the fire or gathering water added to the collective effort that held the village together. The rhythm of building was unhurried. People worked carefully, mindful of the materials and of each other. There was no rush, no pressure to finish quickly. The land had taught them patience, and the structures they built reflected this lesson. They understood that strong homes took time, time to gather, time to shape, time to dry, time to fit every piece into place. As midday approached, the sun cast a warm glow across the homes. Shadows softened, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and sun-warmed clay. The villagers paused their work to share food in the shade, roasted grains, foraged berries, and pieces of dried meat. They sat in small clusters, speaking quietly about the day's tasks, the state of the fields, the arrival of new animals near the stream. After resting, they returned to their work with renewed energy. A group of builders lifted a wooden beam into place, steadying it carefully before binding it with twisted fibers. Another group smoothed the exterior of a mud brick wall, patching cracks and reinforcing corners. Children ran between homes, bringing water, carrying small tools, or delivering messages. By afternoon, the village hummed with a peaceful sense of accomplishment. New walls stood where only loose frames had been that morning. Hearths glowed faintly as fires were rekindled for evening meals. The sensation of home, of true permanence, deepened with every brick placed, every beam adjusted, every handful of clay moulded. As the sun descended behind the hills, the village quieted. People gathered inside their homes, the firelight warming their faces and casting gentle shadows across the walls. Outside, the sky shifted into soft hues of pink and lavender. Birds settled into their nests. The smell of cooked grains and herbs drifted through the air. Within the mud brick homes, families spoke softly about the day. Children curled against woven mats, eyelids heavy with sleep. Elders recounted memories of earlier times, of shelters that once stood only for nights at a time, of journeys stretching far beyond the horizon. And with each passing story, the walls around them felt even more solid, as though the memories themselves reinforced the home. The village rested in the soft embrace of twilight, its homes warmed by shared fires and filled with the quiet contentment of a community that had built its world one patient step at a time. And as night settled fully, the mud brick walls held the day's warmth, promising safety, comfort, and the quiet, steady glow of belonging. Dawn touched the village with a soft glow, spreading light across the fields and the mud brick homes that formed gentle shapes against the horizon. The air carried the faint scent of earth, dew, and something else. A warm, living presence that drifted through the quiet morning. Not far from the edge of the settlement, movement stirred in the tall grasses. A pair of small animals stepped delicately into view, pausing as though listening to the world waking around them. They were not wild creatures in the same sense as the large herds that once roamed the plains. These were smaller, more cautious, yet strangely curious. Their ears turned toward the soft crackle of fires being rekindled, toward the rustle of villagers stepping lightly across the soil. They had been visiting the settlement for several seasons now, drawn by the scent of leftover grains, the warmth of the hearths, and the quiet, predictable presence of the people. At first, these visits had been fleeting, brief appearances at dusk or dawn, moments when the shadows were long and the animals felt hidden enough to approach. But gradually, something shifted. They began to linger, nibbling on stray seeds or exploring the edges of the fields. Over many moons, the people noticed that these animals returned again and again, their shapes becoming familiar against the landscape. This morning, one of the women stood outside her home, scattering a few handfuls of grain near the path that curved toward the fields. She moved slowly, making no sudden motions, her hands opening gently. The grains fell in a soft cascade, landing lightly on the ground. She stepped back, not far, just enough to give space. The two animals, small goats with soft dun-coloured coats, hesitated before moving closer. Their steps were tentative, ears flicking as they watched her from the corner of their vision. When they reached the grain, they lowered their heads and began to eat, their movements quick but careful. The woman remained still, her breath slow and even. Moments like this were not unusual anymore. Over time, the villagers had learned that patience opened many doors, not just with the land, but with the animals that wandered near. As the goats finished the grain, they lifted their heads and offered a long, still glance toward the woman. Not fear, not trust, something in between. The first, fragile thread of a relationship born from countless, quiet encounters. Elsewhere in the village, children were waking. Their sleepy voices drifted through the air as they tumbled out of their homes, rubbing their eyes and stretching in the cool morning breeze. When they spotted the goats near the path, they lowered their voices instinctively, as though not to disturb the gentle scene unfolding. A few steps closer, and the animals would vanish into the grasses. Everyone knew this. So the children watched from afar, learning the same patience their elders practiced daily. As the sun rose higher, more animals appeared near the fields, small flocks of birds, drawn by the insects and grains. A pair of dogs, descendants of wolves that generations ago had begun following human camps. And occasionally wild oxen grazing on distant slopes, their massive forms moving like slow shadows across the land. The wolves-turned-dogs were perhaps the first true companions of early people. Their ancestors had lingered near campsites because the scent of cooked food and the scraps left behind meant easy meals. Over time, certain wolves learned that humans were not always a threat. And humans, watching the wolves' sharp hearing and alert senses, realized these creatures could offer protection. A mutual understanding had been born, cautious at first, but growing stronger over generations. One such dog lay near a hearth this morning, its fur warmed by the gentle flames, its ears perked at the sound of movement, though it did not rise. It recognized the voices, the footsteps, the familiar cadence of a peaceful morning. A young boy approached and knelt beside the dog, running his fingers through its thick fur. The dog closed its eyes, leaning into the touch with a soft exhale. This creature, once wild and wary, now rested as comfortably as any member of the village. The relationship between humans and animals was changing, not through force, but through quiet coexistence. The villagers noticed that certain animals preferred being close to their homes. They observed which ones returned often, which became accustomed to human presence, which allowed themselves to eat near the settlement without fleeing. These small details formed the beginning of domestication, not as a deliberate project, but as a natural unfolding between species learning to rely on one another. Later in the morning, a group of villagers headed toward the fields. As they walked, the goats followed at a distance, bleating softly. The villagers glanced back with gentle smiles. They knew the animals would wander in and out of their presence throughout the day, nibbling on grasses or resting in patches of sunlight. The people did not try to confine them. It was enough for now that the animals felt safe nearby. At the edge of the fields, a woman knelt to inspect the young grain. She brushed her fingers lightly over the stalks, noting their height and colour. The goats watched her carefully, then lowered their heads to graze along the borders, never venturing too deep into the rows of cultivated plants. It seemed as though they sensed the boundary, an invisible line the villagers had drawn, not with fences, but with gentle guidance. Slowly, over many seasons, the villagers learned how to encourage the animals to stay near. They left small piles of grain near the edges of the settlement. They built low enclosures where animals could rest safely at night, though these enclosures were simple and open, more invitation than confinement. And they began to recognize the individual personalities of the animals, some shy, some bold, some curious enough to follow children around the village. One afternoon, the young girl who had tended the fields with her grandmother sat near a shallow pool formed by recent rains. She dipped her fingers into the cool water, drawing ripples across the surface. A small goat approached her hesitantly. She froze, hardly daring to breathe. The goat sniffed the air, stepped closer, and then bent its head to drink. The girl watched, her eyes wide with quiet wonder. In that moment, she felt a connection deeper than words, a gentle recognition that this creature, once a stranger from the wild grasses, now shared the village's world. By evening, the village hummed with soft activity as families prepared their meals. The dogs settled comfortably near the hearths, sensing the warmth and the presence of the people they trusted. The goats found places to rest near the edges of the homes, sheltered from the cooling wind. Birds perched on rooftops, their silhouettes merging with the softening sky. The villagers did not yet think of themselves as keepers of animals. They simply lived with them, sharing space, food, and quiet companionship. But something profound was beginning. With animals living close, the people felt a greater sense of security. They slept, knowing the dogs would alert them to danger. They woke knowing the goats would return with the morning. And, slowly, a new rhythm emerged. Humans caring for animals, and animals offering loyalty, nourishment, and presence in return. As night settled, the sounds of the animals blended with the crackle of fire and the low murmur of voices. The village, alive with both human and animal life, felt fuller, more connected, more whole than ever before. In the quiet glow of firelight, with goats curled near the shelters and dogs watching over the sleeping homes, the first threads of domestication wove gently into the story of the Neolithic world, soft, natural, and carried forward by patience and trust. And beneath the stars, the village rested in the harmony of shared life. The morning drifted gently into the village, soft and pale, as though the daylight were being poured slowly across the earth. A thin veil of mist hung over the stream, giving the water a silvery glow as it wound its way around reeds and stones. The cool air carried the faint scent of clay, grasses, and drying herbs, all reminders of the small but steady transformations taking place within the walls of the growing community. As the sun lifted higher, the village began its quiet hum of activity. The fields rustled with early breezes, the animals shifted in their resting places, and from within the homes came the rhythmic sounds of hands shaping, smoothing, weaving, and moulding. These sounds, soft, steady, and deeply human, had become the heartbeat of daily life. Inside one of the larger shelters, a woman sat cross-legged beside a low basket brimming with long, pliant grasses. The grasses gleamed faintly in the morning light, their pale green strands smooth and cool beneath her fingertips. She lifted a handful, separating each strand with the care of someone who understood that every small detail mattered. Her fingers moved with gentle precision as she began to weave. The pattern started slowly, strand crossing strand, creating a soft, whispering friction that filled the quiet room. Each movement was calm and deliberate. Weaving was not a task to be rushed. It was a conversation between hands and material, between past knowledge and present needs. The woman worked steadily, her breathing matching the rhythm of her fingers. The basket she shaped would carry seeds, herbs, or perhaps even warm coals during the cold months ahead. Nearby, her daughter sat watching, her eyes full of quiet fascination. She leaned closer, studying the woman's hands as they folded the grasses with practiced ease. "Why do the strands stay together?" the girl asked softly. The woman smiled, pausing long enough to brush a loose strand of hair from the girl's face. "Because they share the burden," she replied. "One strand alone cannot carry much. But when they hold each other, they grow stronger." The girl nodded, letting the words settle in her mind. She picked up a few strands herself, imitating her mother's motions. Her attempts were uneven, the pattern loose, but the woman made no corrections. Learning was a slow, gentle process, one that grew naturally, like the plants they tended. Outside, another cluster of villagers gathered near a smooth patch of ground where clay vessels dried in the morning sun. Rows of pots, bowls, and small cups sat warming beneath the sky, their surfaces still soft and faintly damp. Some bore the faint impressions of woven mats they had been shaped upon. Others carried subtle patterns added by fingertips or simple tools. A man knelt beside the vessels, turning them slightly to ensure each part dried evenly. He ran his thumb softly along the rim of one bowl, feeling the smoothness that had taken hours of careful shaping. Pottery was still a new craft for the village, but already it had become indispensable. These vessels held water from the stream, grains from the fields, and food prepared over the communal hearths. They allowed families to store more than a single meal at a time. A quiet revolution that gave the community a sense of security they had never known in their wandering days. Near the edge of the pottery area, a young woman mixed clay and water in a shallow basin. Her hands were coated in the thick, cool substance as she kneaded it into a workable form. Each press and fold created a soft, satisfying sound, a slow, earthy rhythm that blended with the distant calls of birds. She paused now and then to scrape excess clay from her hands, shaping the mixture into a smooth mound. Soon it would be divided into smaller portions for new vessels. Across the village, baskets hung from wooden beams, drying in the warm air. Mats lay stretched across the ground, awaiting the finishing touches that would make them soft enough to sleep on. Nets woven from grasses and thin branches rested near the stream, ready to catch fish or gather aquatic plants. Everywhere you looked, the village was filled with the quiet artistry of human hands. Weaving and pottery were not just practical crafts, they had become expressions of care. Each basket crafted was a promise that food could be gathered, seeds protected, and supplies carried safely. Each pot shaped was a vessel for nourishment, warmth, and the comforting presence of shared meals. And every mat woven from reeds offered rest to tired bodies at the end of long days. By midday, the sun fell warmly across the village, casting soft shadows beneath the branches of nearby trees. A group of women carried finished pots to the hearth, where they would be fired. The firing pit glowed with deep red embers as they placed the vessels around the edges, gradually exposing them to the heat. The air filled with the scent of clay warming, the faint crackle of fire, and the soft murmuring of voices. An older man sat nearby, watching the firing process with a thoughtful expression. He remembered times when food had been cooked only in hides or roasted directly over flames. Now, the villagers prepared stews, boiled herbs, and stored water in ways that would have been impossible before. Each pot represented a new chapter in their relationship with the land, a chapter written slowly, patiently, with every season that passed. Later in the afternoon, as the heat softened and shadows grew longer, weaving took center stage again. Children joined their parents near the shade of the shelters, collecting grasses for new projects. Their small hands struggled at first, but they learned quickly. Laughter filled the air as someone teased a friend for making a lopsided basket. Though the tone was light and affectionate, no one demanded perfection. The finished crafts were celebrations of effort, not flawlessness. Along the stream, a woman dipped a woven mat into the cool water, letting it soak before shaping it more easily. Nearby, two young boys tested their freshly made nets, throwing them gently across patches of reeds and watching how the strands fell into place. Their movements were clumsy but determined, their faces bright with pride each time the net landed neatly. As evening approached, the final pots were removed from the firing pit, their surfaces darkened and firm. The villagers carried them with care to their homes, placing them beside hearths still warm from the day's work. Inside, the glow of firelight reflected gently off the vessels, casting soft patterns across the walls. Families gathered for their evening meal. They ate from the pottery they had shaped, using baskets they had woven, sitting on mats made by their own hands. The village felt full, not in a bustling or overwhelming way, but in a way that wrapped everything in a sense of belonging, The crafts of the day were woven into the fabric of daily life, each one a quiet reminder of how people could transform raw materials into comfort and security. The woman who had been weaving in the morning now sat beside her finished basket, filled with grains that glistened faintly in the firelight. Her daughter curled beside her, eyes heavy with sleep, her small unfinished braid of grasses resting in her lap. The mother brushed her fingers gently through the girl's hair, feeling the soft rise and fall of her breath. Outside, the last light of day faded into twilight. The basket swayed gently in the evening breeze, the pottery cooled slowly in the night air, and the village settled into a quiet calm, filled with the warmth of shared fires and the artistry of careful, patient hands. Every woven strand, every shaped vessel, every smoothed clay surface echoed the same truth. Life in the Neolithic Age was no longer just about surviving. It was about creating, nurturing, and crafting beauty from the simplest elements of the earth. And as darkness wrapped the world, the village rested in the soft glow of human creativity, threaded gently through the night. The morning light arrived quietly, as though it wished not to disturb the village still resting beneath the soft veil of dawn. A thin mist hovered above the fields and low rooftops, blurring the lines between earth and sky. Every sound, a distant bird call, the soft bleating of a goat, the whisper of reeds swaying, felt muted, softened by the gentle hush of early day. In this stillness, the spirit of the Neolithic world felt particularly present, calm, watchful, and woven into every movement of life. Before most villagers had risen, a lone figure walked toward the edge of the settlement where a cluster of stones rested half buried in the earth. These stones had been arranged over many seasons, placed carefully, not by accident, but with a sense of meaning that words alone could not express. Some were smooth from years of handling, others bore faint markings carved into their surfaces. None of the designs were elaborate. They were simple lines, curves and dots, yet each held a quiet significance. The man who approached the stones was one of the elders, his footsteps slow and steady. He carried with him a small pouch filled with powdered ochre, red earth crushed into a fine, warm dust. As he knelt beside the stones, he opened the pouch and let a small pinch fall across the largest of them. The ochre drifted down in a soft cloud, settling into the grooves carved long ago. To a stranger, these markings might have seemed like mere scratches. To the villagers, they were reminders of ancestors, of cycles of the seasons, of the living world around them. Symbols were not yet a language, but they were something close. An early attempt to give form to thoughts too large, too mysterious, too deeply felt to hold inside quietly. Not far from the stones, the sun began to rise more fully, casting a soft glow across the village. Families stirred, emerging from their homes with slow, peaceful motions. As the day began, simple routines unfolded. Fires rekindled, pottery moved from shelters to warm in the light. Baskets gathered for the morning's foraging. Yet woven into these daily tasks was something deeper, a sense of reverence for the land, the sky, the animals, and the unseen forces that shape their lives. In the heart of the village, a small gathering space had naturally formed over time. It was not marked by walls or fences, only by the soft curves of footsteps worn into the earth. Here, people often shared stories during the evening, or gathered to reflect when the seasons changed. This morning, a young woman entered the space, carrying a piece of dried wood in her hands. Its surface was soft and clean, stripped of bark and smooth with stone tools. She sat beneath a tree and began carving gentle lines into the wood. Her tool was a small blade of flint, sharp enough to slice but light enough to control. She worked carefully, her motions slow and deliberate. Each stroke carved a shallow line that formed part of a larger pattern, a spiral, a curve, or a series of dots. She did not follow a strict design. Instead, her hands moved as though guided by memory, instinct, or something deeper. Children often gathered around her during these carving sessions, watching with wide-eyed fascination. Today, two small children settled beside her, their knees drawn up to their chests. They leaned close, trying to follow the path of each line as it took shape. "Why do you make those marks?" one child asked in a quiet voice. The woman paused, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. She smiled gently. "They help me remember," she said. "They remind me of the world, the parts we see and the parts we feel." The children nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of her words. To them, the symbols looked like patterns, something pretty, something curious. But even they could feel that the carvings held meaning beyond their shape. Nearby, another elder approached with a handful of small stones engraved with tiny marks. He placed them in a circle beside the carvings the woman was making, forming a loose arrangement that meant something to those who understood the seasonal cycles. The placement of stones was a kind of quiet ritual, marking the changing of the moon's shape, the approach of needed rains, or the rise of particular stars that signaled planting or harvest times. Nothing was written down, yet knowledge passed through generations with surprising clarity. Later in the morning, the villagers gathered near the fields for a communal task. But even here, the presence of symbols and early belief filled the air. A woman noticed a particular bird gliding low over the grain, a species known to appear just before the rains. She murmured a soft prayer under her breath, touching the soil lightly. A few others did the same. These gestures were not formal, not forced. They were woven seamlessly into daily life, as natural as breathing. Belief in unseen forces was gentle, never frightening. The villagers did not imagine angry spirits or vengeful deities. Their world instead felt filled with quiet presences, the spirit of the stream that kept their fields alive, the spirit of the hearth that warmed their homes, the spirit of the animals who walked beside them. They sensed these presences in the patterns of nature, in the way the wind shifted, in the soft hum of insects, in the changing light at dusk. Some evenings, families gathered around their hearths to share stories that carried traces of these beliefs. One elder spoke of a time when the world had been covered in ice, and how the spirits of warmth had slowly carved their way through the frozen earth. Another told of a great tree that grew at the center of the sky, its roots reaching into the soil of the world, its branches touching every star. These stories were not meant to explain the universe scientifically. They were meant to comfort, to connect, to remind everyone that they belonged to something vast and beautiful. As the day progressed, more markings appeared throughout the village, carved into tools, painted with ochre on the walls of homes, or drawn lightly with a stick in the dirt. Some represented the moon, some the sun, some animals, some simple shapes whose meanings were known only to the hands that created them. But all of them reflected the same truth. People were beginning to understand the world not only through sight and touch, but through meaning. By the time the sun began to set, the village glowed with warm amber light. Fires flickered in the hearths, casting soft shadows across the marked stones, the carved wooden pieces, and the ochre-painted walls. Families gathered together once more, sharing food, stories, and the quiet companionship of evening. A young girl sat beside her grandmother, tracing a finger over a small carved figure made of clay. Its features were soft and simple, a rounded form, gentle curves, no harsh edges. To the girl, it felt comforting in her hand. To the grandmother, it symbolized fertility, growth, and the enduring strength of the earth. "These shapes," the grandmother whispered, "help us remember who we are." The girl nodded sleepily, resting the small figure beside her woven mat as she drifted towards slumber. Outside, the night embraced the village with its cool darkness. The stars shone brilliantly overhead, each one a silent marking in the sky, a pattern humans had followed since long before the Neolithic dawn. The villagers slept beneath these ancient lights, surrounded by the symbols they had carved, painted, and held close to their hearts. And through these symbols, their world, once unpredictable and vast, felt a little closer, a little more understandable, held together by the quiet thread of belief. The morning began with a breeze that carried the scent of distant places, the faint sweetness of unfamiliar flowers, the dryness of far-off stones warmed by another valley's sun, the cool breath of a river that did not belong to this village alone. The air felt subtly different, as if it had travelled long before reaching the settlement. And in its gentle movement, the villagers sensed that today would bring something beyond the usual rhythm of tending fields and shaping clay. Near the centre of the village, a group gathered around the communal hearth. They spoke in low, steady tones, their words filled with calm anticipation. Travellers had been seen at the edge of the distant ridge the evening before, their silhouettes small against the setting sun. These were not strangers in the fearful sense. They were familiar figures, members of a neighbouring group that passed through several times each year, carrying objects and stories from places the villagers had not seen in many seasons. Trade, in its earliest form, was not a loud or bustling affair. It was quiet and respectful, born from the mutual understanding that life was easier when people shared what they had. There was no currency, no bargaining in the way future civilizations would know. Instead, there was an exchange of needs, of gifts, of the simple desire to strengthen ties between communities that might otherwise feel alone in a vast and changing world. As the sun rose higher, the travellers approached the village, their steps slow and peaceful. They carried woven packs on their backs, the contents shifting softly with each movement. Children were the first to notice their arrival. They ran to the edge of the settlement, then stopped a short distance away, remembering what their elders had taught them. Approach with respect, greet with open palms. The travellers responded with the same gesture, palms facing outward, fingers relaxed, a universal sign of peaceful intent. When both groups came close enough, warm smiles formed naturally, and the stillness of morning gave way to soft voices exchanging familiar greetings. One of the travellers, an older man with gentle eyes, stepped toward the village elders. He carried a bundle wrapped in animal hide. With great care, he unwrapped it, revealing several long glossy stones shaped into blades. Their edges gleamed sharply, the material smoother and darker than the flint commonly found near the village. The elders recognized it immediately, obsidian from the distant hills, prized for its precision and beauty. The villagers responded by bringing their own offerings. A woman stepped forward with a basket woven tightly from river reeds, filled with dried herbs known for their healing properties. Another villager brought a clay vessel painted with soft ochre symbols, containing grains collected from the recent harvest. A third offered a thick, cured hide, carefully treated to withstand cold nights. No one asked for exact equivalence. The value of each gift lay not in measurement, but in intention. The exchange unfolded naturally, guided by quiet gestures and shared understanding. When the obsidian blades passed into the villagers' hands, they held them with reverence. These tools would shape better pottery, cut reeds more smoothly, and perhaps even carve more delicate markings into wood and clay. As the exchange continued, the travellers removed other objects from their packs, beads carved from shells found along faraway waters, smooth stones polished by long river journeys, and pigments in colours the villagers rarely saw, deep blacks, rich purples, soft blues. The villagers marvelled at these hues, their fingers brushing lightly over the pigments as though touching a different world. In return, they offered what their village had become known for among neighbouring groups. Baskets woven with extraordinary tightness, mats soft and sturdy enough for sleeping, and small clay vessels that held warmth long after being removed from the fire. These items carried not only craftsmanship, but the warmth of the village spirit woven into every thread and moulded into every curve. Nearby, children watched with wide eyes. To them, the arrival of travellers was magical. They were fascinated by the beads strung on thin cords, the way the colours shimmered in the sunlight, and the unusual shapes of shells that had once belonged to creatures living far beyond the hills. One child reached out to touch a shell, then pulled back shyly. The traveller laughed softly and placed the shell in her hand. Her smile lit up like dawn itself. Throughout the day, the two groups mingled with calm familiarity. Some travellers walked with villagers to the fields, observing how the grain sprouted in neat rows. Others sat near the pottery area, studying the clay vessels with thoughtful admiration. In return, they shared stories of distant valleys where the wind smelled different, of rivers that flowed swiftly beneath towering cliffs, of campsites where families gathered beside fires that reflected stars, unfamiliar to the villagers' skies. These stories held no urgency. They were told in gentle tones, accompanied by gestures that described landscapes and memories. The villagers listened, not out of longing for distant places, but out of appreciation for the wide world that existed beyond their own home. Knowing those places existed gave them comfort, a sense of connection to a world that was gradually becoming more interwoven. As midday passed, a communal meal was prepared. A large clay pot simmered with herbs and grains, its aroma drifting through the village like a warm invitation. Travellers and villagers sat side by side, sharing food from the same bowl, drinking from the same cups. Laughter rose in soft waves. Children played between the groups, carrying beads, stones, and woven trinkets from one person to another, as though continuing the trade in their own joyful way. When the sun began to descend, the travellers prepared to continue their journey. This village was one stop along a path they had travelled many times, a path marked not by foot-worn trails alone, but by relationships strengthened over countless seasons. Before leaving, they placed a few final gifts near the communal hearth. A small pouch of coloured pigment, a beautifully carved wooden pendant, and a polished stone with an intricate swirl pattern worn into its surface. The villagers responded by offering a bundle of dried grain, a new woven mat, and a clay bowl filled with seeds. Seeds that represented not just nourishment, but the potential for growth in lands beyond their own. When the travellers finally shouldered their packs and stepped away, the farewell was soft and unhurried. People raised their hands in the familiar open palm gesture, sending them on their way with warmth and gratitude. The children followed at a respectful distance, watching until the figures blended with the horizon. As dusk settled, the village felt changed, not in shape or size, but in spirit. The obsidian blades lay near the hearth, their edges gleaming in firelight. The beads and shells were admired by those who had received them. The pigments rested beside tools and baskets, ready to be used in future crafts. But beyond these objects, the true gift of the day lingered in the air, the reaffirmation that community stretched beyond the boundaries of the village. Trade paths wove through the valleys and rivers like soft threads, connecting distant hearts. They carried not only goods, but stories, knowledge, and friendship, all of which strengthened the village's place in a larger world. As the night deepened and stars shimmered overhead, the villagers settled into their homes with a quiet sense of belonging radiating from the day's exchanges. The embers in the hearth glowed warmly, reminding them that even when the world felt vast, its pieces were gently connected by footsteps, gifts, and the enduring kindness of human hands. The first hints of change came quietly, carried on a wind that felt different from the warmth of previous days. It swept across the fields with a sharper edge, causing the young grain to bend under its touch. The sky, usually soft with drifting clouds, grew pale and stretched thin, as if holding its breath. The villagers sensed a shift long before the first storm arrived, for they had learned to read the world as carefully as one might read the lines carved into clay. Early one morning, as the horizon lightened, a woman stepped outside her mud-brick home and wrapped her woven shawl close. The air was cool, almost metallic, carrying the scent of distant rain. She looked toward the mountains, where a heavy cloud bank hung low, its edges dark and trembling with movement. As she watched, a rumble echoed faintly across the valley, not loud, but enough to stir unease. Seasons of abundance had taught the villagers to trust the land, but they also understood that nature had moods beyond their control. Some years brought generous rains and rich harvests. Others tested the endurance of even the strongest hearts. The coming season, they feared, might be one of those difficult years. A few elders gathered near the communal hearth, warming their hands and speaking in quiet, steady tones. Their eyes, wise from decades of watching the cycles, showed concern without panic. They knew the signs: cooler winds, birds flying lower, the animals restless in the night. These patterns whispered the same message. The rains would be heavy, perhaps too heavy, and the fields would need protection. Throughout the morning, the villagers prepared. Men and women walked the perimeter of the fields, checking the simple channels they had dug to direct excess water away from the young plants. They reinforced the edges with stones, smoothing soil into small ridges to guide the flow. Children carried armfuls of reeds to help strengthen the barriers, their small feet leaving patterns in the mud as they worked. The sky grew darker by midday, transforming the village into a world of muted tones. A low hum filled the air As the wind swept across the open land, leaves trembled against their branches. The dogs stayed close to the homes, ears alert. Even the usually bold goats rested quietly, sensing the coming change. The first drops fell in the late afternoon, soft, hesitant, spaced far apart. Then, as though the sky could no longer restrain itself, the rain came in earnest. It fell steadily, drumming upon roofs of branches and reeds, splashing into the pathways, soaking the fields in a matter of minutes. The villagers retreated to the shelter of their homes, watching through small openings as the world shifted from gold to grey. Inside, the hearths glowed with steady warmth. Families gathered close, sharing blankets and weaving small baskets as they listened to the rain's gentle roar. The sound was strangely comforting, powerful but rhythmic, like a drum keeping time with the heartbeat of the land. Yet beneath that comfort lay a quiet worry. Would the fields withstand the weight of the storm? Would the young grain survive the night? As darkness settled, the storm intensified. Rain poured in sheets, turning the pathways to rivulets and the open spaces into puddles that reflected the flickering fires within the homes. Thunder rolled softly through the hills, never violent, but heavy enough to shake loose memories of past storms. The villagers whispered prayers to the spirits of earth and sky, not out of fear, but out of respect. They asked only for balance, for mercy, for the strength to endure whatever came. Throughout the long night, the rain continued, but villages of the Neolithic world were built with patience and experience. The mud brick homes held firm, their thick walls absorbing moisture without collapsing. The roofs shed water efficiently, allowing only a few stray droplets to fall near the hearths. These homes, shaped by many hands and sealed with care, protected families from the worst of the storm. When dawn finally arrived, the rain had softened into a mist so light it seemed to float rather than fall. The villagers stepped carefully into the damp world, their feet sinking into the softened earth. The fields lay still beneath a blanket of silver fog, their outlines blurred. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply stood, breathing in the cool, clean air as the world exhaled after its long, restless night. Slowly, they approached the grain. Drops of water clung to the leaves, refracting light like tiny crystals. Some plants had bent under the weight of the storm, but most remained upright. The ridges and channels they had built had guided the excess water away, leaving the roots intact. Relief washed over the villagers like a warm current. The harvest was still possible. But the storm had brought more than rain. It had washed away small sections of the paths, filled the pottery drying area with puddles, and scattered debris across the open spaces. The villagers set to work immediately, not in a rush, but in the calm, determined manner of people accustomed to adapting. They reinforced the paths with stones, drained water from low spots, and set new clay vessels to dry once the sun returned. Over the next days, the storm's presence lingered. Rains returned intermittently, softer, kinder, nourishing the soil while testing its resilience. The villagers watched the skies daily, adjusting their work with quiet wisdom. When the clouds thickened, they strengthened barriers. When the sun broke through, they tended the plants. When the winds calmed, they repaired roofs and straightened leaning walls. Through it all, they held hope in small, steadfast ways. Children collected seeds from plants that had not weathered the storm, storing them in baskets for future seasons. Elders shared stories of years when storms had been far worse. Yet families survived, and adapted. Adults gathered near the fields at dusk, offering thanks for the plants still standing and promises of care for those that struggled. One evening, as golden light spread across the valley, a woman walked through the fields, her fingers brushing gently over the grain. She paused beside a patch that had been damaged, where several plants lay flattened in the mud. Kneeling, she lifted one of the stems with careful hands, patting soil around its base. It might not survive, but she tended it anyway, her actions a quiet symbol of perseverance. Nearby, the girl who had once marveled at the first green shoots watched her. "Will it grow again?" she asked softly. The woman smiled, her expression warm and steady. "We give it a chance," she said. "Sometimes that is all the earth asks of us." As days passed, the fields recovered more fully than anyone had hoped. The rains, though heavy, had soaked the soil deeply, leaving behind moisture that would sustain the plants through dry spells. New leaves unfurled. The stalks strengthened. Life continued its gentle ascent, fueled by both resilience and care. The villagers weathered the season together, sharing food during lean days, checking roofs after rough nights, comforting children when thunder rolled overhead. Each challenge deepened their bond with the land and with one another. When the clouds finally lifted and the sun returned in full warmth, the village felt washed clean, renewed. Light glinted off the wet stones and the fresh green of the fields. The air held the scent of promise, of growth, of abundance, of days shaped not by fear, but by quiet hope. And as the villagers gathered at the edge of the fields that evening, watching the sun sink gently behind the hills, they understood something profound. The land did not ask for perfection, only cooperation. Hard seasons would come, as they always had, but with patience and unity, they could weather them all. The night that followed was calm, the stars bright, the air warm, and in that peaceful darkness, the villagers slept deeply, knowing the world would continue. One cycle, one season, one dawn at a time. The first signs of change did not arrive with noise or sudden motion. They came softly, like most things in the Neolithic world, almost unnoticed at first, woven gently into the rhythm of daily life. A new shelter built slightly farther from the old cluster. A second hearth established by a growing family. Footpaths widening as more feet travelled the same routes. Small clues that hinted at something deeper. The village was beginning to outgrow its original boundaries. One morning, as the sun cast a warm golden glow across the landscape, an elder stood at the top of a small rise overlooking the settlement. He shaded his eyes with his hand and took in the view. Dozens of mud brick homes, smoke curling peacefully from their rooftops. Fields stretching in green arcs toward the horizon. Water shimmering at the stream. Children moving like bright flickers of life between the dwellings. The village had once been a small circle of families. Now it felt like a heartbeat pulsing through the valley. Near the center of the settlement, new structures were being formed, larger, sturdier than before. People gathered in small groups, carrying reeds, stones, clay and timber, working together in a calm, unhurried rhythm. These buildings were not homes. They were storage spaces where grains could be kept through long seasons, protected from rain, wind, and hungry animals. As harvest grew more abundant, The villagers realized they needed shared places to hold what the land gave them. Thus, the first communal granaries began to take shape. A woman placed a smooth stone onto the growing wall of one granary, pressing clay around its edges to seal it. Her hands were patient, steady. "This will hold food for many moons," she murmured, mostly to herself. Another woman beside her nodded, smoothing clay in long strokes. "Our children will not know hunger," she said softly. The thought warmed them both. Across the settlement, another group was constructing a larger meeting space, a place where elders could gather to guide decisions, where stories could be told during long nights, where travelers could be welcomed without crowding the hearths of individual homes. It was nothing like the grand structures of future civilizations. It was simple. A wide roof supported by strong wooden beams, a floor packed firm with earth, walls thick enough to hold warmth. But its existence marked a quiet transformation. Life was no longer centered solely on family hearths. It was beginning to revolve equally around community. Children noticed the changes too. Their play shifted from the narrow paths between homes to the wider spaces forming near the granaries and meeting shelter. They ran freely beneath the beams, pretending to be hunters or farmers or storytellers. Their laughter carried through the air, weaving softly with the sounds of construction, the tapping of stone, the scraping of wood, the low murmur of voices. One child paused to watch the adults work, eyes bright with curiosity. "Why do we need such a big place?" she asked. An elder resting nearby smiled gently. "Because we are many now," he said, "and many voices need space to be heard." The formation of early towns was not the result of planning or ambition. It emerged naturally, step by step, from the needs of the people. As seasons passed and families grew, the settlement expanded outward like the rings of a tree. New homes appeared along well-worn paths. Gardens, once small and scattered, spread into larger patches. People began to specialize more clearly, some becoming skilled toolmakers, others exceptional hunters, others known for their weaving, pottery, or knowledge of herbs. In this growing community, the sharing of labor became more organized. Groups formed to watch the animals, ensuring goats remained near the settlement, and dogs patrolled the edges at night. Other groups tended the fields together, planting and harvesting collectively so that no family bore the burden alone. This unity brought stability. Stability brought growth, and growth brought new forms of connection. In late afternoon, when the heat softened and shadows lengthened, the village buzzed with a gentle energy. Neighbors visited one another to exchange small gifts: a handful of herbs, a freshly fired pot, a newly woven mat, a tool shaped earlier in the day. These exchanges were not formal trades. They were expressions of gratitude and interdependence, each one strengthening the bonds that held the village together. One man walked toward a neighbor's home, carrying a shallow clay bowl filled with roasted grains. He placed it near her hearth with a warm smile. She responded by handing him a small bundle of reeds tied neatly with string. The reed bundle would help reinforce the man's roof, while the roasted grains would feed the woman's family. Such small gestures carried deep meaning, for they reflected the heart of early town life. Every person contributed, every person received. As the outer edges of the settlement expanded, new paths formed. These paths no longer wound only toward fields and streams. They reached outward, following the routes of travelers and connecting the village to distant groups. Some of these paths merged with older trails carved long ago by migrating animals. Others trace the natural contours of the valley, weaving gently between hills and forests. Step by step, the village became a node in a larger web of human movement. One evening, a group of villagers walked these paths to gather clay from a newly discovered deposit farther from the settlement. They carried baskets and stone tools, speaking quietly as they travelled. The journey was peaceful, filled with soft birdsong and the rustle of wind through tall grasses. When they reached the clay, they knelt to dig, their hands working in unison. They laughed gently when one of them slipped and left a deep handprint in the soft earth. Moments like these were simple, but they built a shared memory that lived far longer than the day itself. As night approached, the villagers carried their baskets home. The lights of the settlement glowed faintly in the distance, a cluster of warm points flickering beneath the sky. It looked larger than ever, its shape spreading gently across the land like a constellation mirrored on earth. When they reached home, fires crackled from dozens of hearths, sending soft curls of smoke upward. Families gathered for evening meals, the scent of cooked grains, herbs, and roasted roots drifting across the village. An elder lifted his gaze toward the sky, where stars emerged through the deepening blue. "Each home is a flame," he murmured, "and together they light our world." In the gathering place, where the new roof stood proudly over the packed earth, children sat listening to a storyteller whose voice drifted like a gentle breeze. He spoke of seasons long gone, of distant ancestors who crossed frozen lands, of rivers that once carved new paths through the earth. His stories were not just entertainment. They were the glue that held the expanding community together, threads woven between past and present, reminding everyone of their shared path. As the night deepened, the village lay peaceful, illuminated by dozens of small fires. The boundaries of the settlement had grown, but its heart remained steady, warmed by cooperation, strengthened by shared purpose, and nurtured by the quiet unity of many families living as one. The early village had become something more, a place where people not only survived, but thrived, where the land and its inhabitants existed in harmony, and where the first gentle outlines of a town emerged beneath the stars. And as the moon rose high above the rooftops and fields, the villagers rested, knowing their world was slowly expanding, not through conquest or force, but through the patient weaving of community. The day began with a gentle brightness, the kind that seemed to rise slowly from the earth before touching the sky. Soft rays of morning sun spilled over the roofs of mud brick homes, catching on the edges of stone tools, woven mats, and pottery vessels arranged neatly outside the shelters. The air carried a faint crispness, a sign that the season was shifting once more, guiding the villagers into a time of preparation, adaptation, and careful innovation. Over generations, the village had grown not only in size, but in understanding. People has learned to read the land with remarkable subtlety, to follow the rhythm of the seasons, to shape structure strong enough to withstand storms. But now, they were beginning to master something new, the art of refining their world, of crafting tools and devices that could make their lives gentler, safer, and more efficient. Early in the morning, just as the light softened across the fields, a man stood beside a large slab of stone near the edge of the settlement. This slab served as a workspace for many toolmakers over the years, a surface worn smooth by countless strikes of hammerstones. Today, the man placed a particularly sharp piece of obsidian onto the slab. The dark, glass-like stone glimmered with an inner fire, reflecting both sunlight and the promise of fine craftsmanship. He lifted a rounded hammerstone and tapped the obsidian lightly. A flake snapped off with a satisfying crack, thin, sharp, and gleaming. Another tap, then another, each one precise, creating a blade finer than any his ancestors might have imagined. The man worked patiently, shaping edges capable of slicing reeds cleanly, carving wood with subtle curves, or preparing meat with minimal effort. Nearby, a young apprentice watched him closely. Her eyes followed every movement, her breaths in sync with the rhythm of stone striking stone. She had practiced with softer materials, learning how to control pressure and angle. Today, she would attempt her first obsidian blade. The toolmaker placed a small piece in her hands and nodded encouragingly. She hesitated only briefly before lifting her hammerstone. Her first strike was too light, producing only a dull thud. The second was too strong, chipping off an uneven shard. But the third strike, calm, confident, steady, produced a flake with a clean edge. A small smile crossed her face, and the toolmaker nodded with quiet pride. Like the fields, like the pottery, like the weaving, toolmaking was not simply a skill. It was a language, a way of shaping the world through touch and understanding. Each new blade, each polished stone, each carefully crafted handle expanded the villager's ability to meet challenges with grace. Elsewhere in the village, another kind of innovation was taking shape. A group of women gathered near the stream, where bundles of reeds swayed gently in the morning breeze. Instead of weaving these reeds into familiar baskets and mats, they began experimenting with new patterns. One woman folded reeds over one another in a style she had seen during a visit from travellers. Another twisted strands together more tightly than before, creating cords strong enough to lift heavier vessels. These seemingly small adjustments gradually transformed the villagers' ability to carry water, store seeds, and transport goods along growing trade paths. As the sun rose higher, the pottery area hummed with activity. A man knelt beside a row of freshly shaped pots, their smooth surfaces still damp from the morning's work. Instead of creating the typical round vessels used for cooking or storage, he shaped narrower pots with elongated necks, a design introduced by a distant group encountered during a seasonal gathering. These elongated vessels would help preserve water longer and keep grains safe from insects. A woman approached him with a handful of coloured pigments from the recent trade visit. Deep blue, soft purple, rich black. Together, they began decorating the vessels with simple motifs, spirals mimicking the patterns of wind-blown seeds, waves echoing the movement of the stream, dots representing cycles of the moon. These designs were not purely artistic. They helped families remember which vessels held certain grains, which ones stored water, which were used for rituals or medicinal mixtures. Creativity was becoming as essential as practicality. Across the village, the sound of innovation echoed in new ways. Wooden beams were carved more carefully, creating smoother frames for homes. Clay was mixed with sand and crushed shells to strengthen pottery. Fibers from certain plants were discovered to make stronger ropes when dried in the sun. These improvements built upon generations of knowledge, layer upon layer, like the rings of a tree. Later in the day, a group of hunters gathered at the edge of the settlement to examine a new type of tool. One hunter held a wooden shaft tipped with a small carved groove. Into this groove, he placed a slender, stone-tipped spear. The toolmaker, who had crafted both the spear and the shaft, explained that this design, learned from travelers, allowed the spear to be thrown farther with greater force, using leverage rather than brute strength alone. The hunters tested it in a wide clearing, their movement steady and careful. One threw the spear with the new device, watching as it sliced through the air and struck a distant target with greater accuracy than usual. They exchanged impressed glances, whispering quietly about how such a tool might change their ability to provide for the village, especially during lean seasons. Innovation did not stop with hunting or crafting. It also touched the way people organized their work. A group of villagers began experimenting with storing seeds in clay vessels sealed with mud, creating small caches that protected grains from humidity and pests. Others built raised platforms to dry herbs and plants more efficiently, keeping them safe from animals. Some even began grouping similar tools together near the communal meeting place, forming the earliest signs of shared workshops. In the soft warmth of the afternoon, children played with small wooden carts crafted by one of the village's clever artisans. These carts, simple in design, had wheels carved from rounded pieces of wood. They did not travel far before sticking in the earth, but the idea itself, shaping wood into something that moved, sparked curiosity in young minds. They pushed the carts across smoothed patches of ground, laughing as they watched them roll freely for several steps. Even at their age, they sensed the magic of possibility hidden within these creations. As the afternoon deepened into evening, families gathered near their hearths. The air held the warm scent of roasted roots, herbs, and grains. Meals prepared with tools and vessels that reflected generations of innovation. Children examined new baskets and pottery pieces, tracing their fingers over the designs. Elders spoke softly about how much the village had grown, how new skills had strengthened their community without taking away the simplicity of their lives. One elder sat outside her home, polishing a stone pendant she had carved earlier that day. Its smooth surface reflected the firelight in gentle curves. A young boy approached, watching her hands move across the stone. "How did you make it so smooth?" he asked. She smiled, offering the stone for him to touch. "I listened," she said. "The stone tells you how it wishes to be shaped. You only need patience." The boy nodded, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingertips. Patience. The word settled into his heart like a seed, small now but destined to grow. As night embraced the village, a soft glow spread from the hearths, illuminating the tools laid neatly beside each home. The obsidian blades gleamed like slivers of moonlight. The woven baskets cast delicate shadows across the ground. The pottery, still warm from the day, stood as quiet proof of the village's expanding world. The innovations of this era were not loud or dramatic. They were quiet, intimate, born from necessity and nurtured by curiosity. Each new tool, each refined skill, each simple device made life a little easier, a little safer, a little more connected. And with each improvement, the village felt more capable of meeting the challenges ahead. Lying beneath the stars that night, the villagers drifted into sleep with a sense of quiet pride. Their world was changing, gently, steadily, shaped not by force, but by the careful hands and hopeful minds of people who believed deeply in the promise of tomorrow. And as the moon moved slowly across the sky, its pale light touching every corner of the settlement, the new tools and skills of the Neolithic Age whispered softly of an emerging future. One crafted with patience, curiosity, and the enduring warmth of human ingenuity. The morning rose with a soft, pale brilliance, spreading slowly across the valley like a quiet breath awakening the world. The sky glowed in shades of gold and rose, brushed lightly with the faintest traces of blue. The village stirred beneath this gentle canopy of colour, warmed by the familiar sounds of early activity, the crackle of rekindled hearths, the bleating of goats stretching awake, and the faint scraping of tools being arranged for the day's work. Yet beneath these comforting rhythms, something new had begun to take root. It was subtle, as all great changes tend to be at first. Whispers carried on the wind, new materials discovered in the soil, new ideas exchanged along the slowly expanding trade paths. People felt it in the shape of certain stones brought by travellers, in the glint of sunlight on unfamiliar objects, in the sense that the world beyond the valley was stirring with possibilities that reached farther than their eyes could see. For generations, stone had been the faithful companion of humankind, sharp, dependable, plentiful. Stone blades cut grain, carved wood, shaped homes, and prepared meals. But now, something different shimmered on the horizon of knowledge. Metal, found not in the form of tools yet, but as curious pieces of earth that seemed alive with their own quiet strength. It began with a discovery near the riverbank. One early morning, a boy and his older brother walked along the shallow edge of the stream, searching for smooth stones for tool making. The younger boy paused near a cluster of rocks glinting faintly beneath the water. Curious, he reached down and lifted one into his hands. It was heavy, heavier than flint or obsidian, and its surface carried a warm, reddish hue. The boy called out, and his brother came quickly, examining the stone with careful eyes. When they carried it back to the village, an elder recognized it instantly from stories once told by travellers. Copper, still raw, still locked in its natural form, but full of promise. The villagers gathered around the stone, passing it from hand to hand. Its weight surprised many. Its colour gleamed softly in the morning light. It felt different from the stones they knew, not sharp like obsidian, not rugged like flint, but solid and warm, as though it held a memory of fire deep within it. For days, they studied the piece, turning it over in their hands, striking it lightly with other stones to see how it behaved. It dented rather than shattered. It bent slightly under pressure. It changed shape, not with the brittle obedience of flint, but with a quiet, malleable strength that hinted at something new. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the village in amber light, a group gathered near a roaring fire. Someone placed the copper stone near the heat, curious to see how it would respond. They did not know what to expect. As the fire grew hotter, the stone began to glow faintly, its reddish surface deepening into a dark, living hue. When they touched it with a stick, it shifted slightly, softer now, more open to shaping. The villagers stepped back in awe. They did not yet know the art of smelting or casting. They did not know that this discovery would one day usher in an age of extraordinary transformation. But they understood, even in this early moment, that they were standing at the edge of something powerful. Change, however, does not sweep through a community all at once. It settles gradually, like the slow growth of roots beneath the soil. In the days that followed, life in the village continued with familiar rhythms. Farmers tended the fields, smoothing soil around young plants. Potters shaped clay vessels and painted them with pigments gifted by travellers. Weavers crafted baskets strong enough to carry heavier loads than ever before. Toolmakers shaped obsidian blades with growing skill, knowing that sharpness remained vital even as new materials emerged. Yet everywhere, subtle shifts took place. The toolmaker, who had shaped obsidian for so many seasons, now spent hours studying the raw copper, running his fingers over its surface, tapping it with different stones to understand its nature. He experimented with gently heating small pieces, observing how the metal responded, softening slightly, then hardening again as it cooled. He discovered, by accident, that hammering heated copper made it stronger. This knowledge spread quickly, carried in whispers from hearth to hearth. Nearby, children gathered in fascination, eager to watch every experiment. They marveled at how copper could change shape under careful hands. To them, it must have seemed like magic, earth transformed into something new by fire and patience. But copper was rare, found only in particular places and brought by travellers who followed long, winding paths. The villagers used it sparingly, reserving it for special ornaments, small pendants, or decorative blades meant for ceremonies rather than daily use. Still, these objects carried immense meaning. They symbolized a connection to a wider world, to discoveries unfolding far beyond their valley. At times, travelers shared stories of distant settlements experimenting with fire in new ways, heating stones until the very essence inside them softened. They spoke of villages where people molded metal into shapes never seen before, or where clay furnaces rose beside riverbanks. The villagers listened with wonder, absorbing each tale like seeds planted in fertile soil. One evening, as a group gathered near the meeting shelter, an elder spoke softly about memory. "In our ancestors' time," she said, "we shaped only what the earth gave us in its simple form: stone, clay, reeds, bark, bone. But now, the earth is offering something deeper. It is as if the world wishes to show us that it holds more within its heart." Her voice carried a sense of reverence that settled over the listeners like a gentle blanket. The fire cracked softly at her side, its glow illuminating the faces of the villagers. Young, old, curious, patient. Across the village, innovations continued spreading in quiet waves. A group of hunters experimented with using small copper pieces to reinforce spear shafts, binding them carefully with plant fibers. The copper did not replace the stone tip, but it strengthened the shaft, preventing splintering during hunts. Another group learned to polish copper ornaments until they shone like tiny suns, reflecting flickering firelight in mesmerizing patterns. Children began imitating these innovations with their toys, shaping small lumps of softened clay into imitation metal objects, or constructing miniature furnaces from mud and twigs. Their play reflected the shifting world, even before they fully understood its significance. Meanwhile, the land itself continued to change, shaped by climatic shifts and the steady expansion of human settlement. Forests thinned as people gathered wood for new building techniques. Paths grew more defined as trade increased. The once small village felt full, vibrant, aware of itself as part of something larger. Near the river, a woman noticed that certain heavy stones, ones with dark, rust-red streaks, behaved strangely in fire. When heated long enough, they released small beads of metal, tiny and dazzling. She called others to witness the phenomenon. Together, they knelt beside the stones, their eyes wide with wonder, their hands trembling slightly with excitement. They did not yet have the tools or understanding to extract metal fully, but they recognized the significance. These stones were different. They held potential. Discovery spread once again, quietly, like dawn creeping across a hillside. As the season progressed, people adapted their daily routines to incorporate new skills. They learned to build stronger fires using carefully arranged wood and charcoal-like embers. They lined hearths with stones that held heat longer. They constructed simple windbreaks to protect flames from unexpected gusts. Without realizing it, they were building the foundations for something greater, the knowledge that would one day become metallurgy. Yet for all the shifts and discoveries, daily life remained slow, steady, peaceful. At dusk, the villagers gathered beneath the stars to share food and companionship. Clay bowls passed from hand to hand. Children curled beside their parents, lulled by the soft murmurs of evening stories. Dogs settled at the edges of the gathering, their warm bodies creating a comforting presence. The night sky glimmered with quiet brilliance. Beneath it, the copper ornaments worn by a few villagers caught the firelight and shimmered gently like embers carried from the future. One young girl looked up at the stars, then down at the ornament resting in her palm. "It's like holding a piece of the sky," she whispered. Her mother smiled, brushing her fingers through the girl's hair. "Perhaps the earth and sky are not so far apart," she said. "Perhaps we are learning to understand both." As the firelight flickered across their faces, a sense of calm possibility filled the air. The old age of stone had not ended. Stone tools still dominated daily life. But something new was emerging, not loudly, not abruptly, but with the quiet persistence that defined the Neolithic spirit. An age of curiosity, an age of transformation, an age where humanity stood on the threshold of metal, still rooted deeply in the peaceful rhythms of the earth, yet reaching gently toward the unknown. And beneath the soft glow of the moon, the villagers slept with the faint sense that they were part of a world slowly shifting, a world that invited them to discover, to shape, and to dream. The morning rose with a quiet brilliance, spreading slowly across the land, as though the earth itself wished to savor the first breath of a new day. Light touched the tops of the mud brick homes, glided over the rippling fields of grain, and shimmered along the surface of the gently flowing stream. It illuminated the footprints on well-worn paths, the soft curves of clay vessels drying in the sun, and the patient forms of animals resting near the shelters. The world felt calm, familiar, and deeply alive. The villagers stirred gradually, waking with the same steady rhythm that had shaped their lives for generations. A potter stepped outside her home and inhaled the crisp morning air. A farmer knelt beside the fields, brushing dew from tender stalks. Children wandered sleepily toward the stream to splash their hands in the cool water. Dogs stretched beside the hearths, their quiet movements merging seamlessly with the peaceful dawn. Life had settled into a balance, not static, not unchanging, but steady like the tide, like the seasons. like a heartbeat passed down from ancestors who had once wandered across vast landscapes in search of food and shelter. Now, their descendants lived in a world that felt rooted, intentional, and filled with subtle purpose. It was a world shaped by countless small acts: a seed pressed into soil, a reed woven into a basket, a stone shaped into a blade, a clay vessel warmed by fire. Each action carried echoes of the past and whispers of the future. And without realizing it, the villagers had laid the earliest foundations of what humanity would one day become. As the sun rose higher, the settlement came fully alive. The fields glowed with the soft green of ripening grain. The animals grazed peacefully along the edges of the village, their presence a comforting reminder of the quiet partnership that had grown between species. The granaries stood tall, filled with the promise of coming seasons. The meeting shelter, strengthened by community and shared wisdom, stood like a guardian at the heart of the settlement. To the villagers, these structures were simply parts of their everyday world. But to the flow of human history, they represented some of the most profound transformations ever to take place. Through farming, humanity had learned to cultivate not only plants, but stability. Through domestication, they had found companionship, warmth, protection, and a new understanding of the natural world. Through weaving, pottery, and toolmaking, they had discovered creativity, a gentle kind of ingenuity that sprouted like wildflowers in the hands of those who believed in the quiet possibilities of the earth. And now, with the earliest discoveries of metal, the villagers stood at the threshold of another era. Though they did not yet know it, their world was shifting, expanding, preparing for innovations that would continue to ripple outward for thousands of years. Late in the morning, a small group gathered near the communal hearth. Elders sat with young children, sharing stories of the earliest days. Stories of wandering under wide skies, of sleeping beneath stars with no shelter but the warmth of fire, of discovering the first clusters of wild grain that hinted at a different kind of future. The children listened with bright, curious eyes. To them, the idea of a world without homes, without fields, without familiar paths, felt distant and difficult to imagine. One of the elders, her voice soft but steady, spoke about the river valleys her ancestors once travelled through, following herds that moved with the seasons. She told of a time when each sunrise brought uncertainty, where the next meal would come from, which direction the group would travel, how the weather might shift. She paused, letting the gentle weight of those memories settle into the air. "Now," she whispered, touching the earth beside her, "we live in a place that remembers us." Her words carried a quiet truth. The land itself had become part of the community. It held the footprints of ancestors, the roots of crops planted by countless hands, the ashes of fires that had warmed generations. In return, the villagers tended the earth with care, offering respect through every seed, every harvest, every shared meal. As the day stretched onward, the sense of continuity deepened. A potter shaped a vessel using a design passed down from her grandmother. A group of hunters prepared tools sharpened with new techniques discovered only recently. Children wove small mats using patterns learned from both mothers and travelers. Every skill, every creation, every craft carried the imprint of time, a delicate blend of old knowledge and new imagination. By afternoon, the sun held a warm, steady glow over the village. The fields shimmered like ribbons of gold. The air filled with the scents of earth, grain, and herbs drying near the hearths. People moved with the gentle confidence of a community, that knew its place in the world and trusted the land that nurtured it. Near the meeting shelter, a young woman sat carving small lines into a smooth piece of wood. These markings, simple and abstract, represented cycles she had observed: the phases of the moon, the ebb and flow of seasons, the growth of crops from seed to stalk. She was not creating a language, not yet, but she was capturing memory, giving shape to time itself. In her hands, the future of storytelling, record-keeping, and symbolic thought shimmered in its earliest form. As evening approached, a soft amber glow spread across the settlement. The villagers gathered for a communal meal, sharing roasted roots, freshly baked flatbread, and fragrant herbs. Laughter rose like music as the youngest children recounted their games near the stream. Elders nodded with warm smiles, comforted by the sight of youth flourishing in a world shaped by the patience and perseverance of so many generations. Once the meal ended, the people drifted toward the open space near the central hearth. The sky above darkened into a deep velvety blue, and stars appeared, one by one, in a shimmering arc across the heavens. The fires crackled softly, sending small sparks upward like tiny fragments of light returning to the sky. Families gathered close, wrapped in woven blankets, the cool night air brushing their skin. The dogs curled near their feet, offering warmth and quiet companionship. The goats settled near the edge of the fields, their soft sounds blending with the whispering grasses. An elder stepped forward, her silhouette outlined by firelight. She spoke in a gentle voice, carrying the calm authority of someone who had witnessed many seasons. "We have built a life that grows like the fields," she said, "rooted in the earth, fed by our work, strengthened by our unity. And though the world will change, and new materials will shape our tools, and new ideas will guide our hands, may we never forget the simplicity that brought us here." She paused, letting the fire crackle softly in the silence. "The land remembers us, and we remember the land." The villagers closed their eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of those words settle into their bones. The stars above glimmered gently, as though nodding in agreement. It was in this peaceful moment, surrounded by their homes, their fields, their animals, and one another, that the villagers understood the heart of the Neolithic Age. Not a time of sudden inventions or grand monuments, but a time of small, steady transformations that shaped the very foundation of human life. The quiet mastery of seed and soil, the warmth of domesticated fire, the companionship of animals drawn near, the patient shaping of stone, clay, and reed, the gentle awakening of community, memory, and meaning. These threads wove together into a tapestry of life that would endure far beyond their own years, carrying humanity toward futures they could not yet imagine. Futures filled with metal, wheels, writing, cities, and civilizations. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, life was simple, full, and beautifully complete. Under the watchful glow of the moon, the villagers drifted towards sleep. One by one, hearths dimmed to soft embers. The air grew cool and still. The land embraced them gently, holding their dreams as tenderly as it held their seeds. And as the final fires settled into glowing warmth, the world exhaled, peaceful and calm, a world forever shaped by the people who had learned to listen to the earth and build a life upon its patient wisdom. Sleep well, traveller. May the quiet spirit of the Neolithic Age guide your rest and brighten your dreams.